The revolution wasn't noble, it was necessary. The myth of pristine heroic war for freedom collapses when examining actual decisions Continental Army leadership made to sustain resistance against British forces that possessed overwhelming advantages in resources, training, and strategic position throughout conflict. Shattering textbook narratives that emphasize idealism and principled resistance reveals how Army survived not through moral superiority, but through ruthless, painful decisions that commanders made when circumstances demanded choosing between unpleasant alternatives or accepting defeat that would have ended revolution permanently. Most textbooks never mention decisions that contradict heroic narrative executions of deserters, destruction of civilian communities, abandonment of entire regions to British occupation, and use of terror against spies and collaborators who threatened continental operations. These hard choices reflected harsh realities of war, fought on edge of collapse, where Continental Army constantly faced possibility of disintegration through desertion, starvation, or military defeat that would have eliminated organized resistance to British authority. The tone must acknowledge that Revolutionary War was not clean conflict between good and evil, but was desperate struggle where American commanders made morally compromising decisions because circumstances left no alternatives consistent with achieving independence. Hard choices included ordering retreats that abandoned civilians to British retaliation, executing soldiers whose desertion threatened unit cohesion, destroying indigenous communities to eliminate British allies, and hanging spies despite public sympathy for condemned men. Harsh realities meant that liberty was won through methods that modern sensibilities find disturbing: calculated cruelty, strategic sacrifice of people and territory, and willingness to inflict suffering on enemies and civilians, when military necessity demanded actions that contradicted revolutionary rhetoric about natural rights and human dignity. A war fought on edge of collapse required commanders to prioritize survival over principles, when principles threatened to produce defeat, demonstrating that independence was achieved through brutal pragmatism rather than through consistent adherence to ideals that declaration proclaimed, but that wartime circumstances often made impossible to honor fully. When Army was ordered to run, Washington retreated from New York through New Jersey in autumn 1776, after British forces had defeated Continental Army in series of battles, demonstrating professional British superiority over American forces that could not withstand coordinated British assaults executed by disciplined regulars, supported by artillery and naval power. He abandons towns and civilians to British occupation during withdrawal that prioritized Army's survival over defending territory or protecting populations who had supported revolutionary cause and who now faced British retaliation for their previous resistance. Through New Jersey, where local populations watched Continental Army retreat without fighting to defend communities that would suffer under British occupation, Washington's decision reflected brutal calculation that losing territory, while preserving army, served strategic interests better than defending towns that British forces could capture anyway, while destroying Continental forces in process, a decision many contemporaries saw as betrayal because Washington's retreat abandoned patriots to British vengeance, his failure to defend New Jersey appearing as cowardice rather than as strategic wisdom, prioritizing long-term survival over short-term defense of indefensible positions. And cowardice were accusations Washington faced from civilians who believed Continental Army had obligation to defend them regardless of military circumstances, from politicians who feared retreat would demoralize supporters and encourage British sympathizers, and from officers who believed honor required standing to fight rather than retreating continuously before British advance. His retreat contradicted revolutionary rhetoric about defending liberty and protecting patriots from British tyranny, making Washington's strategic calculations appear as abandonment of principles that revolution claimed to serve. The decision prioritized military over political considerations, recognizing that Army's destruction would end revolution, regardless of how many towns were defended briefly before falling to British forces that Continental Army could not defeat in sustained combat during autumn 1776, when American forces were demoralized by defeats and depleted by expired enlistments that were reducing Continental strength daily, as soldiers went home rather than continuing service in army that seemed headed toward inevitable defeat. The retreat that saved revolution preserved Continental Army through avoiding battles that British forces would have won decisively, allowing Washington to maintain organized resistance despite losing territory and abandoning civilians to British occupation that seemed to demonstrate revolutionary causes' failure. By refusing to die on British terms, through accepting battles where British advantages would guarantee American defeat, Washington kept army intact for eventual counterattack at Trenton that would restore American morale and demonstrate that revolution remained viable despite autumn's disasters. Sets up Trenton by leading British forces to believe Continental Army was broken force, incapable of offensive operations, creating conditions for surprise attack on December 26th, when Washington crossed Delaware River and struck Hessian garrison, whose commander had not anticipated American assault because Washington's previous retreats suggested he lacked capability or will for aggressive action. Buys time for war to continue by preventing Continental Army's destruction during period when defeat would have ended organized resistance before French intervention could provide support necessary for eventual American victory. A brutal sacrifice of land and people characterized Washington's retreat as strategic decision that abandoned civilians to British occupation while preserving military force capable of continuing resistance, demonstrating that revolutionary leadership prioritized army's survival over protecting populations who suffered under occupation that Washington's retreat had allowed. But only path to survival for revolutionary cause that would have died if Continental Army had been destroyed, defending indefensible positions during autumn 1776, when circumstances favored British forces overwhelmingly. The sacrifice proved strategically sound when Trenton victory and subsequent operations demonstrated that Washington's retreat had been tactical wisdom rather than cowardice, vindicating his decision to abandon territory temporarily while maintaining army that could strike back when circumstances favored American success. His willingness to appear cowardly while actually preserving revolutionary causes' only military instrument showed strategic vision transcending immediate political pressures and public opinion that demanded heroic stands regardless of military consequences that such stands would have produced for army that British would have destroyed through forcing premature battles. Shooting their own men became necessary policy at Valley Forge during winter, 1777 to 1778, when morale collapsed under privation and when desertion threatened to dissolve Continental Army, before spring campaigns could resume. With collapse threatening unit cohesion, as soldiers deserted daily to return home where they might survive winter that Valley Forge seemed unlikely to allow, Washington approves executions of deserters despite understanding that shooting Americans for refusing to continue suffering seemed to contradict revolutionary ideals about individual liberty and voluntary service. To halt mass exodus that was reducing Continental Army's strength through desertions that accelerated as conditions at Valley Forge worsened, and as soldiers concluded that dying at home was preferable to freezing and starving in camp, that could not provide basic necessities. A horrifying decision that terrified camp because executions demonstrated that Continental Command would kill Americans to maintain discipline, using methods that seemed to contradict revolution's opposition to British military tyranny that included harsh punishments for soldiers who violated military law, and restored discipline by creating fear that desertion would result in death rather than in escape from Valley Forge's suffering, changing calculations that soldiers made about whether remaining in camp or deserting offered better prospects for survival. The executions were public spectacles, designed to maximize their deterrent effect by showing entire units what happened to soldiers who deserted, making example of condemned men whose deaths were intended to prevent others from following their choice to abandon army. Washington's approval of executions reflected recognition that Continental Army would dissolve without harsh measures, preventing desertion that was destroying units' combat effectiveness and that threatened to reduce army to numbers incapable of resuming operations when spring arrived. His willingness to execute Americans for desertion showed that maintaining an army capable of fighting required ruthless enforcement of discipline, even when enforcement methods contradicted revolutionary rhetoric about liberty, and when executions seemed to confirm British claims that rebels were tyrants who ruled through force rather than through popular consent. Fear as weapon characterized Continental Army's use of execution, threat to maintain discipline when positive incentives like pay, food, and adequate shelter could not be provided to soldiers whose service was becoming increasingly involuntary as circumstances made leaving more dangerous than staying. The brutality works because desertion plummets. Once soldiers understood that attempting to leave meant risking execution if captured, making suffering at Valley Forge seem preferable to death by firing squad, that public executions demonstrated was certain fate for deserters who were caught. Desertion rates decreased dramatically after executions established credible threat. Units stabilize, as soldiers who might have deserted concluded that remaining in camp offered better survival prospects than attempting escape that might end before firing squad. Order returns to Continental Army as discipline based on fear replaced voluntary service that had characterized early revolution, but that could not sustain army through hardships that made continued service seem irrational to soldiers, whose primary concern was personal survival rather than abstract political principles. A cold reminder that liberty was won under command that sometimes ruled by fear rather than through inspiring voluntary sacrifice. Valley Forge executions demonstrated that revolutionary leadership would use violence against Americans when maintaining army required harsh measures that contradicted ideals revolution proclaimed. The executions revealed tension between revolutionary rhetoric, emphasizing individual liberty, and military necessity, requiring coercive discipline that made service compulsory through threat of execution for soldiers who attempted to exercise liberty by leaving army. That ruled by fear, when circumstances made positive motivation insufficient for maintaining discipline necessary for military effectiveness. Continental Command demonstrated willingness to execute Americans whose desertion threatened army's survival. Liberty's achievement through methods resembling tyranny created moral contradiction that revolutionary leadership accepted because alternative was army's dissolution and revolution's failure, showing that winning independence required compromising principles that independence was supposed to vindicate through establishing government, respecting individual rights that military discipline violated routinely through coercive measures including execution of deserters. Burning villages for freedom was Continental Army's campaign against Iroquois Confederacy in 1779, when Washington ordered General Sullivan to destroy indigenous communities that had allied with British and that had conducted raids against American frontier settlements. The army destroys crops, homes, and entire communities across Iroquois territory in systematic campaign, eliminating indigenous peoples' capacity for continued resistance through destroying food supplies and shelter necessary for surviving approaching winter. Across territory where Iroquois had lived for centuries, Continental forces burned crops standing in fields, destroyed stored food supplies, burned longhouses and entire villages, and cut down orchards that provided sustenance, creating humanitarian disaster for thousands of indigenous people who would face winter without adequate food or shelter. A military decision Washington believed necessary for ending indigenous raids that were killing American frontier settlers and for eliminating British indigenous allies whose military effectiveness made them dangerous enemies despite their relatively small numbers. But devastating for thousands of civilians who had not participated in raids against American settlements, but who suffered equally with warriors when Continental Army destroyed entire communities without distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. The campaign was explicitly designed to inflict maximum suffering on indigenous populations through destroying means of survival rather than through killing people directly, creating conditions where starvation and exposure would eliminate indigenous capacity for resistance more effectively than military defeats could accomplish. For freedom from British alliance with indigenous peoples who threatened American expansion into territories that indigenous communities occupied and that American settlers coveted for agriculture, Washington's scorched earth campaign served strategic and economic interests that had nothing to do with independence principles, but that reflected American determination to eliminate indigenous peoples as obstacles to westward expansion that revolution was supposed to enable through removing British restrictions on colonial settlement beyond Appalachian Mountains. Breaking Confederacy's power resulted from Sullivan's campaign, destroying Iroquois communities' capacity for conducting military operations through eliminating food supplies and shelter that warriors needed for sustaining resistance against American forces. The harsh campaign cripples Britain's indigenous allies by creating humanitarian crisis that forced Iroquois to seek British assistance for surviving winter rather than conducting raids against American settlements, effectively ending indigenous military threat to New York and Pennsylvania frontiers. Restores frontier safety by eliminating indigenous capacity for raids that had terrorized American settlers and that had tied down Continental forces needed for campaigns against British regular forces, allowing redeployment of troops previously needed for frontier defense. Reshapes New York forever through destroying Iroquois communities that had dominated region for generations, opening territories for American settlement that would transform demographic and political character of New York's interior through replacing indigenous populations with American farmers, whose settlement would make reconstitution of Iroquois power impossible. A victory obtained through destruction rather than through battlefield heroics, where Continental forces defeated indigenous warriors in combat. Sullivan's campaign achieved strategic objectives through targeting civilians and infrastructure rather than through engaging military forces directly. Not battlefield heroics, but systematic destruction of communities characterized campaign that modern standards would condemn as war crimes, but that revolutionary leadership celebrated as necessary measure for securing frontiers and for eliminating British indigenous allies whose raids had diverted Continental resources from main theatres of war. The campaign demonstrated that revolutionary war was not exclusively conflict over political principles, but was also war of expansion and conquest, where American forces destroyed indigenous peoples standing in way of territorial ambitions. That revolution was supposed to fulfill through eliminating British restrictions on American settlement. Washington's willingness to order wholesale destruction of indigenous communities showed that revolutionary leadership would use extreme measures against populations they defined as enemies, revealing that principles about natural rights and human dignity did not extend to indigenous peoples whose lands Americans wanted and whose resistance Americans would eliminate through whatever means proved effective, regardless of humanitarian costs. Abandoning Charleston and Carolinas was a strategic decision Washington and Congress made in 1780, when British shifted focus to Southern campaign and when Continental resources were insufficient for defending all theatres. Simultaneously, they decide to send minimal aid to South because concentrating limited Continental forces in single theatre seemed more likely to produce decisive results than dispersing troops across multiple regions where none would possess adequate strength for defeating British forces operating in each area, effectively allowing Charleston and much of region to fall to British occupation that would last for years. Abandonment left tens of thousands of patriots without support from Continental Army or Congress that had promised to defend them against British forces. Tens of thousands suffer under British occupation that American strategic calculus had accepted as necessary sacrifice for maintaining Continental Army's strength in northern theatres, where Washington believed decisive campaigns would be fought. Left without support from Continental forces that had withdrawn or that had never been sent in adequate numbers, Southern patriots faced British occupation, loyalist violence, and economic devastation without meaningful assistance from Continental government that had effectively written off region as temporarily lost. The abandonment seemed like betrayal to Southerners who had supported revolution expecting Continental protection against British retaliation, but who discovered that strategic priorities meant their suffering was acceptable cost for concentrating resources elsewhere. Of patriots who believed Continental cause meant defending all regions equally rather than sacrificing some areas to strengthen others, reflected harsh reality that Continental resources were inadequate for defending entire territory that Britain could attack, forcing choices about which regions would receive support and which would be abandoned temporarily to British occupation. Washington's decision to concentrate forces in northern theatres, while largely abandoning South, demonstrated strategic thinking that prioritized long-term victory over immediate defense of all patriots, accepting that some Americans would suffer under British occupation as price for maintaining Continental Army capable of eventually winning war through campaigns in theatres where Continental strength could be concentrated effectively. The strategy behind suffering was Continental calculation, that losing South temporarily, while preserving Army's strength for eventual counteroffensive, would serve strategic interests better than dispersing forces across all theatres, in futile attempts to defend everywhere simultaneously. This sacrifice frees resources for Greene's later strategy that would gradually recover southern territories through campaign of manoeuvre and attrition that British could not counter effectively once Continental forces were concentrated adequately for sustained operations. Ultimately leads to Cornwallis's overextension, as British commander pursued Greene through Carolinas in campaign that exhausted British forces and that drove them into Virginia, where they would be trapped at Yorktown. Paving road to Yorktown by forcing British to commit resources to occupying and pacifying South in campaigns that drained British strength, while Continental forces were rebuilding capacity for decisive operations that would end British offensive capability permanently. A brutal calculus characterized decision to lose South temporarily in order to win war eventually, demonstrating that revolutionary leadership would accept suffering of thousands of Americans in regions that were abandoned strategically for sake of concentrating resources where they might produce decisive results. Lose South to win war was explicit strategic logic that Washington and Congress accepted, despite knowing that abandonment meant years of suffering for Southern patriots who would endure British occupation without Continental support until strategic situation allowed commitment of adequate forces for recovery operations. The strategy's success vindicated brutal decision to abandon South when Continental forces eventually recovered region and when British defeat at Yorktown resulted partly from overextension produced by occupying territories that Continental strategy had yielded temporarily. But vindication came too late for thousands who had suffered under British occupation that Continental abandonment had made possible, demonstrating that strategic success sometimes required accepting humanitarian costs that victims of strategy bore without compensation or recognition that their suffering had served strategic purposes. Washington's willingness to sacrifice entire regions showed that winning war required ruthless prioritization that contradicted revolutionary rhetoric about defending all patriots equally against British oppression. The gallows of revolution saw multiple executions of British and Loyalist spies, whom Washington ordered hanged despite public sympathy and diplomatic pressure for clemency that reflected belief that execution was excessive punishment for curs. Espionage. Washington orders hangings, including infamous case of Major John André in 1780, British intelligence officer captured while coordinating Benedict Arnold's betrayal of West Point, whose execution Washington approved despite André's popularity and despite British threats of retaliation against American prisoners. Despite public sympathy for André, whose gentlemanly conduct and personal courage had earned respect from American officers who regretted necessity of executing him, Washington remained unbending in applying military law that prescribed death for spies regardless of their personal qualities or of diplomatic complications their executions might create. Diplomatic pressure from British, who threatened to execute American prisoners in retaliation, failed to move Washington from position that spies must be executed to deter future espionage regardless of consequences for specific individuals or for diplomatic relations. A cold, unbending use of military law characterized Washington's approach to espionage cases, where he consistently ordered executions despite understanding that killing spies created martyrs, and despite personal reluctance to order deaths of men he might have respected as individuals. His determination to execute spies reflected calculation that deterring espionage through harsh punishment served Continental interests more than clemency that might have preserved diplomatic relationships, but that would have encouraged Continued British espionage operations against Continental Army. Of military law that Washington enforced rigorously, despite costs in public sympathy and despite diplomatic complications, demonstrated his prioritization of military necessity over humanitarian concerns that might have justified clemency. In specific cases, the executions were deliberate policy rather than emotional reactions, designed to send message that spying against Continental Army would result in death regardless of spies' nationality, social status, or personal conduct that might otherwise have earned sympathy from captors who nevertheless would execute them according to military law that Washington refused to modify for diplomatic or humanitarian considerations. Terror as deterrence characterized Washington's consistent execution of spies whose deaths were intended to discourage others from accepting British intelligence missions against Continental Army. These executions cripple British espionage operations by making intelligence gathering more dangerous and by reducing number of people willing to spy when execution was known, a consequence of capture rather than imprisonment or exchange, that might have allowed survival. Protect American plans at critical moments by preventing British from obtaining intelligence about continental operations, troop strengths, and strategic intentions that effective espionage would have provided to British commanders whose planning depended partly on intelligence from spies and informants operating in American-controlled territories. At critical moments when surprise was essential for American operations, absence of British intelligence resulting from deterrent effect of executions prevented British from anticipating continental moves. The brutal message Washington sent through consistent execution of captured spies was unambiguous: betray Continental Army, and you die regardless of your nationality, your social status, your personal conduct, or diplomatic pressures for clemency that Washington would ignore in enforcing military law. And you die was certainty that Washington established through refusing clemency in any espionage case, creating credible deterrent that reduced British ability to recruit spies and informants whose intelligence gathering was essential for British operational planning. The executions demonstrated that Washington would use terror systematically when military necessity required deterring activities that threatened continental operations, revealing that revolutionary leadership accepted brutal methods when circumstances demanded effective responses to security threats that could not be eliminated through gentler means. His willingness to execute spies consistently despite public sympathy for condemned men and despite diplomatic complications showed that winning war required ruthless enforcement of discipline and security measures that contradicted revolutionary ideals about humanity and proportional punishment, but that Washington believed necessary for protecting Continental Army from espionage that could have produced defeats, negating everything revolution hoped to achieve through military resistance. The dark decisions that built nation emerge clearly when examining Continental Army's actual conduct during Revolutionary War, rather than accepting sanitized narratives emphasizing heroism and idealism. Freedom wasn't carved by clean, heroic moments celebrated in textbooks, but was achieved through savage choices made in desperation when commanders faced situations where all available options were morally compromising, but where choosing least bad alternative was necessary for sustaining resistance that would eventually produce independence. By choices that violated principles, revolution proclaimed executing Americans for desertion, destroying indigenous communities, abandoning patriots to British occupation, hanging spies despite public sympathy. Continental leadership demonstrated that achieving independence required compromising ideals when military necessity demanded harsh measures. The revolution's victory wasn't noble in sense of being achieved through consistent adherence to principles about natural rights and human dignity, but was necessary for establishing American independence that required winning war, regardless of whether winning required methods contradicting revolutionary rhetoric. It was necessary for achieving independence that justified brutal methods through results they produced. Continental leadership accepted that winning required compromising principles temporarily for sake of achieving independence that would eventually allow establishment of government, respecting rights that wartime necessity required, violating, and sometimes brutally so characterized Revolutionary War, where independence was won through methods that modern sensibilities find disturbing, but that circumstances demanded when alternative was accepting defeat that would have meant permanent British rule over colonies whose rebellion had challenged but had not defeated imperial authority. The truth about how independence was actually won contradicts comfortable myths about revolution as noble struggle where American virtue triumphed over British tyranny, revealing instead that victory resulted from willingness to make savage choices when circumstances left no morally clean alternatives, consistent with achieving independence that required sustaining military resistance through whatever means proved necessary, regardless of humanitarian costs or moral contradictions those means created. Understanding that revolution succeeded through brutal pragmatism rather than through idealistic heroism provides more accurate but less comforting picture of how United States actually achieved independence that founding mythology celebrates without acknowledging dark decisions that made independence possible. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.